So now, I got about 10 minutes. I got a short chapter here. I want to go through this because I really want to get into Exodus. So we need to understand the prophesied captivity. By the way, the prophesied captivity for our time too, by the way. I don't know why that should make anybody happy, but you know you're getting close to the end time. You say when you see these things draw near, lift your head up high because salvation draws near. Foundation of Scriptures. Israel was prophesied to go into captivity before Israel was ever born. That's interesting, huh? Israel was prophesied to go into captivity before Israel, which is Jacob, was ever born. We know that because the story tells Abraham. Genesis chapter 11, verse 31 and 32. All right, and Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot and his son Haran and his daughter-in-law Sarai and his son Abram's wife, and they went with him out of Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and dwelt there. And so the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. All right, so now let's go to the map. I've got it over here that Danny put on the board for me. All right, so now we're going to... Uh-oh. Somebody just lost the resurrection. You saw that? Let me see whose name's on it. No, just kidding. I'm afraid to look. It could be mine. All right. So now we got our maps. This is going to be really interesting. Hopefully I can get this with chalk. And we just read that God called them out of the land of Ur, which is right here, Ur, okay? All right, let me go over here on my map. And Danny said I got to be careful with the chalk because it likes to break. So here's where we are when God began speaking to him. What's really, really interesting with this is when he talked to him, what hasn't grown yet, but will grow later, is right about here. Is Babylon. In the New Testament, God tells us, come out of her, my people. Talks about Babylon, doesn't it? So now we're seeing the stories from the point of view of the Father, talking with the Son, saying, come out. All right, the Father and the Son is talking about they got to come out of sin. So we got that here. So what do we have? We have Babylon right there. So now, the interesting thing with the journeys of Abraham is that they went to Haran, right? Exodus 12, 1 through 4. Before I go there, let me go back over here. In Exodus 11, what we just read, he left Ur and he went this direction and he stayed there until his dad died. He stayed there. So now if you look at my map that I put over there where the yellow is, isn't it interesting that what I put in yellow is the Babylonian Empire? And so what Satan is doing is that in 12:4, Genesis 12:4, we see him taking him now down into this area in Canaan. When I study these things, and I'm saying, look what's going on here. Y'all see this map? Is what Satan does is Satan comes behind everywhere God is, trying to wreck everything that God has done. Now, if you're sitting at home and you're studying this, let me tell you how I think of this. If God is not a respecter of persons, and I'm looking at my life and where he's taking me, who's on my trail? Satan's following everywhere God wants me to go, trying to destroy everything God's doing in you. So now the Bible isn't just something you've read from the past. It becomes living today in your life. Why? Because he's just given us an example how things work. I find this extremely interesting with the church. The worldwide Church of God, when it broke down and began to be destroyed, it was Protestant churches who came and took over the work of God. Everywhere God went, Satan came behind it to erase everything that God was doing. It also happened with the CGI. is that when they began to break up and they had to sell the land, a Protestant church bought it. In other words, when God has swept your house and made you clean, the demons that leave are waiting to come back. You see the story? All right, so now, in Genesis, and that should be Genesis, by the way. That should not be Exodus 12, 1 through 4. That should be Genesis. So I can get that corrected because I can't go back and correct it now because we're doing this live here. So this here, instead of Exodus, that's Genesis 12. In Genesis 12, 1 through 4, it says, Now the Lord said to Abram, Get you out of your country and from your kindred and your father's house to a land that I will show you. What are we looking at? Remember now, we're telling you the story of the Father from a father's point of view. Jesus Christ says he came and he tabernacled with us. That means temporary dwelling. For 7,000 years, like we had on the other side, Jesus Christ, the Father's telling us, listen, you need to go down there and you need to redeem these people. So it's the story of Jesus having to leave his throne in heaven to come down and dwell with mankind for 7,000 years. See the story? That's the story building up into the Exodus. So he says, get you from your land. In verse 4 it says, so Abram departed. He just left. He says, okay. Jesus Christ, when he came, he says, I didn't come to do my will, but the will of him who sent me. Now we know from the story of Abraham, by the time he reached here, he never lived in a house again. He lived in tents because he was looking for the city not built by hand. He wanted his maker, whose builder was God. And so when you and I prepare to go to the kingdom, Jesus Christ is up there right now building all of that. And he's going to bring it back. It's going to be, he says, there are many houses in my Father's house, many abodes, and I'm coming back. He says, I'm going to give you a place. So the house that you and I are going to be going is going to be with Jesus Christ for 1,000 years. So when Jesus Christ called you through the Father calls through Jesus Christ. Let me back that up. You have a place. That means you have to leave where you are. How do you do that? That means everything that brought you and connected you to this world, you got to get it out of. It's got to be gone. That you've got to have this new, fresh walk with God. It's as if you're taking this journey now with God. And on your heels is Satan trying to pull you back. So if you've been having troubles and difficulties, it's understandable because you see, as you become one of God's people, Satan has lost one of his. It's an incredible journey. All right, now going on. All right, so now he goes down in Exodus chapter 4, and they wind up in the promised land. The prophesied captivity. The first hint of Israel's family would go into captivity also begins with Abraham in chapter 15 of Genesis. It says, and when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. And God said to Abram, know of a surety that your seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Jacob hasn't been born yet. Abraham doesn't have any children yet. But this is the promise that God was laying out. As a footnote, in Exodus 12, verse 43, it says this, and it came to pass at the end of 430 years, on the self-same day it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out of the land of Egypt. When did they go out? On the 15th day of the first month. It is a night to be much observed. And God promised that that was going to happen. Going on with the prophesied captivity, same chapter, verse 14 through 16 in Genesis. It says, and also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterwards they would come out with great substance. Now, I talked about that briefly just a few minutes ago. And they did come out because they spoiled the Egyptians. They had gold and silver and had all what they needed to build God's tabernacle in the wilderness. And you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come here again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So it's like God has it for mercy in this weight that he weighs out the mercy against sin, giving time for people to repent. So this is the former. the captivity. There will be a latter captivity. Look what it says in Isaiah 11. And this is where you and I come into play in this story. It shall come to pass that in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people who are left from Assyria and Egypt and from Pathros. And it goes on and on, naming other locations. It says, unless the Lord of hosts had left us a very small remnant, this is in Isaiah 1, verse 9. Unless the Lord had left us a very small remnant, we should have become like Sodom, and we would have been like Gomorrah. So in other words, your calling that God has given you has put a seed now. And in that seed is to give us the Spirit of God in a world that's dying, so that everyone doesn't become like Sodom and Gomorrah. The lost track of time. After 400 years, the Israelites had lost all track of time, including the eternal Sabbath day. The time had to be reestablished. And through this reestablishment of time and duality of events, that the God revealed his plan for mankind, one of the greatest secrets of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And I thought I put one more verse in here. Yeah. This is where I was going to stop, and then at the last minute before I left my house this morning, I wanted to add this. The beginnings of redemption. Exodus 3, verse 2 through 4. This is the beginning of God's redemption, and it is the same way that God's redemption was added for you. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire in the midst of a bush. And so he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, and why the bush does not burn. I've mentioned this in sermons in the past, but so I want to do that again now, especially for the new people. When I watched the story of the Ten Commandments, you see Moses looking across the field, and he's looking at the mountain, it's glowing. And you see him, you don't know how long he's there watching this glow. It could have been day after day, or week after week. Could have been month after month that he sees this bush. But the way verse 3 is written, let me show you this. When Moses said, I will now turn aside to see this thing, it's written as if he'd been looking for a long time and never really bothered with it. So I want to address a question to those who may be having something going on in your head today. If there's something that's been bothering you about your faith and about your calling, I want you to do this. I want you to do like Moses just did. Take some time and turn aside to see what God is doing in your life. And here's why. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him in the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. I don't know what God has in store for every single person, but I know this. If you don't do this, if you don't turn aside to see this great sight, what God's doing in your life, God is not going to take the time to call you. You could be like the one whom many called, few are chosen. This is the beginning of the redemption for God's people. It's two parts. It's what Jesus Christ has done for us, and it's you turning aside to take a look. And we're going to do that next time as we pick up the next chapter on the Exodus.